You can see my screen.
Yes.
All right, so let's start with a review. Hello?
Which chapter is that?
Page 105, chapter 8. All right, this is just a review, okay? This is not a full lesson on fluid and electrolyte regulation. We have passive and active modes of transport. By passive, meaning these are automatic. Your body doesn't have to do anything. Fluids just move depending on the changes of the concentration. So from one body compartment to another, intracellular, extracellular, and on the extracellular part, we have two subcomponents there in your bloodstream, which is your plasma, and then spaces in between, which is your interstitial space, right? So water moves constantly throughout the day as the concentrations change. So let's say if I don't give you a break and um, you get thirsty, but then you still can't get a break because let's say I don't let you. Okay. So the concentrations in your plasma, fluid concentrations will change, correct? And
Yeah.
you'll notice that there will be changes also in your urine output. Urine output starts to drop. So these are natural consequences of fluid movement as the amount of fluid in your blood now changes. So they will manifest in certain signs and symptoms. Okay. So let's review osmosis. So what is osmosis, Miss Lou?
like the water concentration.
Okay,
Um,
so yeah,
Changing
osmosis.
on the difference of the water concentration.
Okay, so let's review then. Osmosis is the movement of water from an area of lesser concentration to an area of greater concentration. For instance, if let's say
I thought it was the opposite. Thought it was higher to lower.
that would be diffusion. So in osmosis, I'll demonstrate.
Professor,
Yes.
I thought diffusion was only for gases, and I thought they both have the same, like moving from a greater concentration to a lesser concentration.
Yeah, that's a movement of solutes, but for osmosis, it's from an area of lesser to greater. Let me demonstrate.
Okay.
You see my whiteboard, right? Okay, so let's say in diabetes, for instance, so this is your bloodstream. If we add more solutes there, and these are your cells, so if we increase blood sugar, for instance, in the bloodstream, okay, so these triangles here represent glucose molecules. Now, all of a sudden, what happens to the number of solutes inside the capillaries?
Okay.
They increase, right? So now osmosis is the movement. This is passive movement of water from an area of lesser concentration to an area of greater concentration. Since sugar molecules are large molecules, they cannot pass through the semi-permeable membrane of your capillaries without insulin. So let's say this is a diabetic patient with very little or no insulin. So as the concentration of the blood increased, osmosis happens. So the only way to achieve homeostasis, or if you balance the concentration of the compartments, is for water now to leave the cells and enter the bloodstream. So thereby, if you increase the water in the bloodstream by pulling it from the cells, putting it into the capillaries, into the bloodstream, now you achieve homeostasis because now you've equalized the concentration now. The only way you can equalize it is by adding more water in your plasma. Thereby now they are equal in concentration. However, what will that do to the cells by so doing? If you pull water from the cells to add to the bloodstream in order to equalize the concentration of the compartments, what happened to the cells?
You shrink the cell.
Okay, they will shrink. So these are the changes that naturally occur. So the same thing, even if let's say you guys are not diabetic. So let's change this. Let's not put sugar. So you guys are not diabetic. Let's change this to dehydration now. In the same way, so let's say I change the triangles here. These are not glucose molecules. This time these are the cells. These are red blood cells. These are platelets. These are white blood cells. Okay. So in a dehydrated person, such as yourselves, in a couple hours, if let's say I don't give you a break, you will become a bit dehydrated. So the same thing will now happen because there is no water intake. The bloodstream suddenly becomes more concentrated because there is less solvent, meaning less water compared to the suspended substances in there. So the concentration again increases. There is now less water compared to the cells suspended in it. Same thing will happen. So the osmotic pressure of the blood increases all of a sudden because of the less water compared to the solutes. They will again pull water according to osmosis. This is all passive. Water again will automatically be pulled from your cells going into the bloodstream, into the plasma, resulting in the same condition. Understand osmosis?
Yeah.
Okay. So let's go back to chapter. So this represents figure 8-4 represents the normal fluid intake and output. So that's how we get our fluid intake, averaging about 2,500 ml per day. That's not only through beverages, we also have from food and from metabolism, meaning your body will change whatever you put inside your mouth into liquid. Output, on the other hand, it's not only through urine, but normally every day we pee about 1,500 ml. That changes, of course, in relation to how much you drink. But urine is not the only measurable output. Fluid loss is also achieved through insensible means. So as you can see there from feces, we have about 100 ml of water there, another 400 from constantly breathing or talking. And then through skin, that also varies. Weather is getting warmer now, so we tend to sweat more, so that may increase up to 900 ml per day. Let's review also IV solutions. IV solutions can be iso, hypo, and hypertonic. Here is diffusion. So unlike osmosis, wherein the water moves from an area of lesser concentration to an area of greater concentration, osmosis is the basis for choosing the IV fluid given to a patient. So let's review. In an isotonic solution, examples are normal saline and LR, lactated ringers. So where will isotonic solutions go if you administer it to a patient, since it's the same concentration as plasma?
Go into the cell.
Where will it go?
Into the cell.
I can't hear you.
Wouldn't it stay in the plasma if it's the same?
Okay, since it is isotonic, it will not go anywhere. Isotonic solutions such as your crystalloids, normal saline, and lactated ringers do not go anywhere. So if your purpose is to simply improve perfusion by increasing blood pressure, by increasing preload, by increasing blood volume, you need an isotonic solution. So this would be good for maintenance as well as for rescue or as part of initial therapy. So let's say you have a patient who is severely dehydrated and vital signs are blood pressures less than 90, heart rates in the 120s. So the patient needs to, regardless of the mechanism of fluid loss, the patient must receive isotonic solutions initially. Probably for the first hour, the purpose is just simply to increase blood pressure to maintain perfusion. Once your blood pressures reach 90 or above, then we consider the patient out of danger at least, and then now we can concentrate on correcting the mechanism of fluid loss. Now, deciding that will now depend what is the cause of the fluid loss for the patient. And then based on that, we will decide whether we use hypotonic or hypertonic solutions. So going back to our illustration earlier, it really depends on what you want to do. So if, let's say you have a patient who has edema, okay? Patient has edema. So there's lots of fluid not only inside the cell, but also around it. So you have lots of water here. Water here. Okay, these are cells again. So you want to draw the water out of the interstitial space back in here into the bloodstream so that the kidneys can get rid of it. Go to the kidneys so that the kidneys can eliminate the excess fluid. What type of solution will help you achieve that goal? Because you want to draw water from the interstitial space and from the cells that are right now very swollen. Okay, very swollen cells. So what type of solution, according to osmosis, can help you achieve that?
Hypertonic.
Is it hypotonic?
Okay, so you will do hypertonic.
Hypertonic.
Hyper, because again, osmosis says water must move. It's not a choice. Water has no choice. According to osmosis, it has to move from an area of lesser concentration to an area of greater concentration. So in osmosis, think of it as a tug
Professor,
of war. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question. This is Donna. From what I'm reading from the textbook, it says that fluid shifts from higher to lower concentration.
What page are you referring to?
105.
Which paragraph?
The first one, first sentence.
Read it again.
It says regulation of intracellular and extracellular fluids is based upon fluid shifts from a higher concentration of solute to a lower concentration through the membrane separating them.
Okay, so how do you understand that? Did it say higher concentration of water or solutes?
Solute.
Okay, so what do you understand by solute versus the solvent? So let's say you're preparing a drink, okay, and you put sugar in your drink. Which one is the solute? Which one is the solvent?
Sugar. Sugar is a solvent.
No.
No.
No, water is the solute.
Water is the solvent.
No. Water is the solvent.
solvent.
Sugar is the solute.
Water is a solvent.
Water
Sugar
is
is
the
a solvent.
solvent.
So in a solution, the wet stuff is the solvent. Whatever you add in there is the solute. So going back here, but that's a very good question though. You were just, don't worry, you're just probably the only brave one to ask. So here, which one is the solute? So let's say if I add glucose here or even red blood cells. Okay, let's say these are red blood cells. Which one is the solute? Which one is the solvent? So again, anything wet is the solvent. So that refers to plasma, which is composed of albumin and water. And anything suspended in the solution are the solutes. So what you read here is, this is saying the first sentence says fluid must move from an area of higher concentration to a lower concentration of solutes though. Okay?
Yes.
So do you understand now?
Yes.
So here in our illustration, if you add a hypertonic solution into the bloodstream, tonicity is also equal to osmotic pressure, meaning whichever compartment has a greater number of solutes, meaning suspended solutions, let's say sugar, red blood cells, or whatever you put in that solution, it makes the osmotic pressure in that compartment higher. So since a hypertonic solution has a greater concentration of solutes, it will command water to enter it. So I always compare this as a tug of war, meaning imagine the solutes there, the suspended particles in the solution as people. And obviously, if you have lesser concentration here or even here, who has more people? There are more people in this compartment because you put a hypertonic solution there. So in a tug of war, it's always the side that has more people that will win the tug of war, correct? And that tug of war, we are pulling water here. So water will always go to a compartment that has more solutes, because that's what the law of osmosis goes. Okay, so there's nothing you can do by osmosis. This will happen. Okay, it's a natural event of nature that water will have to move from an area of lesser concentration to an area of greater concentration. It will pull it. It will be pulled by a hypertonic solution. So this is correct. So if you want to decrease edema, you have to give a hypertonic solution. And then on the other hand, if you have a different problem, so let's say you have now a very dehydrated cell. These are shrunken cells. After the initial isotonic solution, because again, if let's say this is Trinessa, okay, Trinessa had 16 diarrhea episodes, and then another 16 vomiting episodes, and then 16 bleeding. Okay, she's also bleeding 16 times. Say it's a heavy period day. Okay, so she is severely volume depleted. So after you give isotonic, because again our priority is ABC, correct?
Yeah.
So to meet perfusion, you have to meet circulation needs first. So after, let's say, we gave her 1 liter of isotonic, just to improve blood pressure, just to make sure she stays alive. Now her blood pressure is now 95 over 62. She's pretty okay now, right? So she's pretty stable. Now we have to correct these dehydrated cells. So after the NS or the isotonic solution, what comes next? How will you fix these dehydrated cells now? What type of solution will you administer?
Hypotonic.
Hypotonic.
Hypotonic. So hypotonic, since in relation to the cells now have a higher concentration compared to this hypotonic solution. So again, according to osmosis, water must move from an area of lesser concentration to an area of greater concentration. So therefore, they make this hypotonic solution go out of the bloodstream and enter the cells, solving your dehydration problem. Are we clear with IV solutions and
Yeah.
how doctors decide on what to use?
Yeah.
Okay, but don't forget the priorities, okay? So of course we will give the hypotonic solution, but also remember your priorities. It's always ABC. Until the patient is stable, we really can't put priority on these dehydrated cells because ABC must come first. Are we clear?
Yeah.
All right. So
Professor,
I'll let you. Yes, go ahead.
so let's say the problem is localized instead of systematic. Let's say, would you run into the problem of fixing a problem for the localized issue, but run into the opposite problem for the body that's otherwise regular?
Start. Say the first part of what you said again.
Let's say
The problem.
a patient has a localized edema, and then you run the hypertonic solution to try to
No.
fix the localized edema.
Yeah.
Would you run into the problem of like shrinking cells in other parts of the body, which was regularly, like normally regular?
Okay, that's a different problem now because obviously the problem, if it's localized edema, then it's not a systemic problem. So you cannot solve a localized problem with a systemic solution. Does that make sense? So let's say you have swelling in one part of the body, so whatever your example is, it's more of a inflammatory problem in that area. Or so let's say that area is, let's say, in a dependent position. So a localized problem, our solution will also be localized. So that will be either solved by either raising that extremity, that limb, or applying alternating heat and cold, warm and cold compresses. Okay, so that's a totally separate issue. We're talking about a systemic problem here, just like what happened to Trinessa, for instance.
Got it.
That makes sense? Okay.
Professor, I have a
So,
question.
yeah, go ahead.
People who have edema, do they have high blood pressure?
It really depends on we'll get to that next. Okay. So when we do we will do our 2 exemplars today, diabetes insipidus and SIADH, which are completely opposites, and then we'll see the problems, okay, so that we can compare signs and symptoms as well as treatment. Okay, but very good question. All right, before we go, let's look at our regulatory mechanisms. Let's review again. So I started with changes that occur naturally. So as the day goes by, depending on your actions, you will at some point experience either fluid volume deficit or fluid volume overload. Now, how come you're not hospitalized? How come none of us need hospitalization when these things happen? Like right now, my mouth's really dry.
Because our body regulates.
Yeah, hold on. Let me hydrate first.
Oh, sorry.
Because I've been talking, so I lost a lot of fluid from breathing, right?
Right.
So my my hypothalamus told me that, hey, you need to start drinking. Okay, so if I'm
Also, if you stop breathing, you'll stop losing the fluid.
okay, well, that's not a good idea either. All right, so let's say I'm now 70 years old. Is my thirst mechanism still intact?
No.
Okay, so that's why you can realize elderly are very prone to dehydration because they don't have that sensory ability anymore. Okay, or at least that function is very decreased already. So let's look at the regulatory mechanism. So we have the renal, endocrine, and the respiratory, and oh, that's it. Okay, let's start with those. So real quick, kidneys, you have two of them. They're a big role in fluid and electrolyte regulation is probably it's irreplaceable. Okay, the kidneys are responsible for regulating fluid and electrolyte balances. They they can simply choose to, of course, they're controlled by your hypothalamus as well as the pituitary gland, which also controls the endocrine glands, which is your adrenal glands sitting on top of the kidney. So they sense the pressure. So any changes in pressure in the concentration of the blood and the amount of electrolytes that pass through the kidneys, and by so doing they can make adjustments. So they can choose either to increase urine output or decrease urine output. Okay, as simple as that. And then same thing as with electrolytes. So we can't lose majority of our electrolytes. 80% are excreted by the kidneys. To a lesser extent, maybe 20% is excreted through the sweat glands, okay, through your skin. So majority is done by the kidneys. The endocrine system, so we're referring to your adrenal glands here mostly, are responsible, of course, for sodium and potassium balance, referring to the aldosterone, the hormone aldosterone. So let's review the RAS system. So this is your RAAS. So there are two parts to this system. There's a Ra, which is your Renin-Angiotensin system, in which your lungs are involved. And then there's the aldosterone system. The AS part is where your adrenals and your kidneys play a part. So long story short, the trigger here is drop in blood pressure. Not only this, either your blood pressure drops, meaning did your blood volume also drop, possibly?
Yeah.
Yes, that's also another trigger. What else does your blood carry? Does your blood carry oxygen?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So therefore, a drop in blood pressure, and then consider also what else is in that blood. That blood also carries sugar, oxygen, sodium levels. So all of those are your triggers. So this figure just says drop in blood pressure, but really that's not the only trigger. Because remember that blood also carries oxygen. So therefore, if blood oxygen drops, it will also trigger the mechanism. If sodium levels drop, that will also trigger this. If blood volume drops, it will also trigger this. These are all automatic. So the Ra part is involved in the vessels. So renin-angiotensin, once you have a drop in blood pressure, drop in oxygen, etc., it will cause or trigger the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. So first, Renin is produced, they meet angiotensin 1, and it will be met with the angiotensin converting enzyme from the lungs, converting 1 to angiotensin 2. This now causes vasoconstriction, and vasoconstriction will increase afterload or vascular resistance. And the other part, which is aldosterone, also occurring at the same time. So aldosterone is responsible for two things. It will cause sodium and water to be reabsorbed. So all of these, the increase in blood volume and the increase in vascular resistance, all lead to increased blood pressure. All right, so in everyday events like you and me right now, this is good because it's preserving blood pressure, perfusion, it's maintaining body function. It will be a disaster though when we go to heart failure, because all these mechanisms which increase vascular resistance and the increase in blood volume are not really helpful in a patient with heart failure. In all other people like you and me, yes, this is a life-saving measure. However, in a patient with heart failure or even renal failure, this is not helpful. This will actually help kill the patient. That's why one of our interventions in those people will be to give drugs to stop the renin-angiotensin system. Because these, you cannot stop these. These are part of the autonomic nervous system. They will occur because these are regulatory or compensatory mechanisms. So all you can do is just suppress it using drug therapy. We'll get there when we discuss chapter 35, I think, heart failure. So that's the renin-angiotensin part. Let's go now to the role of the hypothalamus. So this also plays a role in regulatory or a compensatory mechanism. So in periods of the same thing, you have low blood pressure, low blood volume, low oxygen, low sodium levels. This will again trigger the release of not only your renin-angiotensin, but in the hypothalamus, antidiuretic hormone is also being released. Unlike aldosterone, which I did not. Okay, so yeah, aldosterone will be released by the adrenal cortex. In response to this, again, same drop in blood pressure. Aldosterone, we said, causes salt and water reabsorption at the kidneys. The hypothalamus, on the other hand, also helps by secreting antidiuretic hormone. Now, unlike aldosterone, where it reabsorbs salt, antidiuretic hormone only calls for water reabsorption, not sodium reabsorption. Clear? So that's the difference between these two hormones. ADH controls water, aldosterone controls sodium and water. That will make sense later when we talk about SIADH and diabetes insipidus. Now, there is a counter-regulatory hormone here. So there's a difference here. A regulatory hormone is to increase blood pressure, meaning we want to improve perfusion by two things, increasing resistance and also increasing volume. The counter-regulatory hormone, which is natriuretic peptides, we have two. We have A, or atrial, and we have B, which is brain natriuretic peptide. Although it says it's in the brain because this was first discovered in the brain, it's actually produced by the ventricles of your heart. So we have two here. We have A type and B-type natriuretic peptides, these are counter-regulatory hormones. So unlike here, wherein your renin-angiotensin system and your antidiuretic hormone release, this one is different because this one is in response to increased blood pressure and blood volume. So this is now the opposite. If you have a condition wherein you are in fluid overload, these will not be released. Your renin-angiotensin system will not be triggered. The antidiuretic hormone release will not be triggered. What will be triggered instead are your A and B type natriuretic peptides. So these have the opposite effect of your renin-angiotensin system. Let's review. So your renin-angiotensin system causes vasoconstriction and salt and water reabsorption, correct? If this is the total opposite, so therefore what will this cause?
Vasodilation.
This will cause in vasodilation plus the excretion of more water. So this will cause diuresis as well as vasodilation. Any question about that? Okay, we'll talk about BNP specifically when we get to heart failure again, because that is the other problem. You are in fluid overload in that, in the case of heart failure. So we have the respiratory system. We know that this also participates in water excretion. So we lose that much water every day through breathing and talking. So here is the illustration of ADH regulation. So it's simply a regulatory response. So the same thing, you lose water, blood pressure drops, sodium level drops, oxygen drops, this will be released. Okay, and then it only controls water, so this will cause an increase in blood volume. And then we have insensible losses. Again, this varies. Let's go now to the indicators. Now let's finish this because this will not change. When we go to SIADH and diabetes insipidus, the findings are the same. Okay, meaning you won't assess something else. So whether you have a case of fluid volume deficit or a case of fluid volume overload, you will look at the same indicators. Okay, so whether it's a heart problem, a kidney problem, a endocrine problem, if it involves fluid imbalances, you are looking at the same indicators, which will tell you whether or not the patient is in fluid deficit or in fluid overload. Are you with me so far? Anna?
Yes.
Yeah.
All right, so let's start with what are these indicators? So you have a long list here. You have starting from weight, serum osmolarity. Serum osmolarity meaning the concentration of your plasma specifically. BUN creatinine and specific gravity. BUN creatinine are waste products. These are metabolic waste products and which are eliminated by the kidneys. So that will be your indication whether or not the kidneys are working. And we know that the kidneys' role is to regulate fluid and electrolyte balances as well as elimination of metabolic waste. So therefore, let's start with the weight. So water has weight. Every liter of water equals 1 pound fluid gained or fluid lost. 1 kilogram No, sorry. 1 pound is equal to 500 ml of fluid. 1 kilogram of weight, water weight, is equal to 1 liter. Again, every liter of fluid, of weight, sorry. No, sorry. Let's me start with weight because they're not, it can be confusing because fluid is a measure of volume, right? Whereas weight is a measure of mass. So 1 kilogram lost or gained is equal to 1 liter of fluid lost or gained. 1 pound, every 1 pound of weight lost or gained equals 500 milliliters of fluid lost or gained. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, so 1 kilogram, 1 liter, 1 pound, 500 ml. So therefore, you can easily tell whether or not the patient lost or gained fluids by weighing them. This is especially helpful in the case of heart failure and also kidney failure. In fact, when you have a patient on dialysis, they have to weigh the patient before and after dialysis to determine how much fluid did we remove. Serum osmolarity are very sensitive to changes in the fluid. You can see it directly on your hematocrit and hemoglobin. We'll discuss that shortly. And like already said, BUN and creatinine are metabolic waste products. So if they increase, that means are the kidneys working?
No, if they increase, the kidney is not working properly.
Okay, and then vice versa, that means the concentration of your blood is also very diluted if they increase. So simply put, what happens to your weight when you are in fluid overload?
It increases.
Increases, and opposite when you're dehydrated will be weight loss. Osmolarity, or the concentration of your blood, what happens to it when you are in fluid overload?
The concentration, wouldn't it decrease?
Very decreased because you're, think of it this way. If you're in fluid overload, when we draw blood from your veins, what will that blood look like? Will it be concentrated or diluted?
Diluted.
It will be diluted, so it will decrease your serum osmolarity. BUN creatinine, in fluid overload, the blood sample we took was very diluted. What will happen to your BUN creatinine in fluid overload?
Wouldn't it be low?
It will drop because again, we're talking about the concentration of the blood sample here. And opposite will happen if you're dehydrated, BUN creatinine will rise. Urine specific gravity, this is now the concentration of your urine. What is the normal specific gravity? 1.001 to 1.030, correct? So,
Yeah.
in a patient in fluid overload, what happens to your urine output?
It's gonna increase.
Increase.
Therefore, what will happen to your urine specific gravity? If you have a very high urine output, will your urine be diluted or concentrated?
Dilute.
Very dilute.
Diluted.
Therefore, what will happen to specific gravity?
It would decrease.
It would decrease. And then, of course, opposite will happen in fluid volume deficit. Is everybody getting this? Because
Yes.
on the exam, okay, so on the exam later, when we get to heart failure, we haven't gone to heart failure and renal failure yet. We're just looking at the basics here because we're not going to repeat this. Once we get this over with, the signs and symptoms and laboratory values will now make sense when we talk about the exemplars. Yes, somebody had a question? Okay. Please read the rest here, okay, on your own. So I already gave you a rundown, so please read the explanations here, especially the lab values.
Okay.
No, sorry, my mistake for the specific gravity. This book uses 1.005 to 1.030. I said earlier 1.001, so this book uses 005. Okay, here are your exemplars, okay, examples that will increase or decrease your serum concentration. So that means if these conditions increase osmolarity or increase the concentration of your serum, of your plasma, are these conditions leading to fluid volume deficit or fluid volume overload?
Deficit.
Deficit. Now, don't be confused with SIADH. I'll explain later. Okay, so among these, all of these conditions lead to dehydration, but the urine in SIADH is weird. Okay, this is the only fluid overload condition that is present in this collection here, meaning all of these conditions lead to dehydration except SIADH. In fact, SIADH is a fluid overload problem. However, because they have so much ADH, because this stands for syndrome of inappropriate antidiuretic hormone. So this patient here has a really high level of antidiuretic hormone. So therefore, they will reabsorb water at abnormally high amounts. However, because they're doing that, the urine output drops. So therefore, the urine output looks very dehydrated, looks very concentrated. Okay, so this is the only weird thing in this list. All of these conditions again result in loss of water, loss of fluid in the body, no matter how you look at it. However, except this one. So this is the only odd one out here. This is actually a fluid overload condition. However, because they have very little urine output, so the urine output here in SIADH looks very concentrated, um, very minute. You know, they have very little urine output because all the water is being reabsorbed. And these conditions are the opposite. So these conditions decrease osmolarity or decrease the concentration. So therefore, these conditions are they in fluid volume deficit or fluid volume overload? They decrease the concentration. So what's happening to the blood sample? Is the blood sample diluted or concentrated?
It's concentrated.
No, decrease osmolarity.
Diluted.
Diluted. So if these conditions here result in dehydration, except SIDH, these conditions here result in
Fluid overload.
fluid overload, except diabetes insipidus. So these are two odd ones here as far as urine. So these are the only exceptions. I said here, these are all dehydration or fluid deficit problems, right? Except SIADH. Here, these are all fluid volume overload problems, except diabetes insipidus. Now, why is the urine in a very dehydrated diabetes insipidus patient very dilute? Because this is the opposite of SIADH. In SIADH, you have a high level of antidiuretic hormone, causing your body to reabsorb a lot of water. As a result, very little urine is produced. Here, this is the opposite now. This is a very dehydrated patient because this patient won't stop peeing. These patients can lose up to 4 liters of urine minimum per day. As a result, what will happen to the concentration of their urine if you're peeing almost every hour?
It's gonna decrease.
It's gonna be a very dilute urine. It's gonna be so dilute that you probably can drink it back. I mean, it's sterile. Oh, you can probably pee into a cup and then drink it right back. That's nasty, but technically speaking, if you don't have water, yeah, you can do that. Questions? Let's move on. I think that's it for fluid review. It's already almost 10. Let's take a break.
Wait,
Come
Professor,
back.
I have
Yes.
a question. So what if you didn't go over other things? Are we responsible for those?
Like what other things?
Like other things in this chapter?
Yeah, I can't go through the whole. I mean, it will take us a week to go through every page. I'm just
So,
introducing, yeah, the concept.
so we're responsible for everything else.
Yeah, these are examples. I mean, especially age-related changes, meaning this will tell you that these are normal changes. Okay, this is not necessarily abnormal. When we grow old, this will happen.
Okay.
All right. Again, I'm not reading the whole textbook for you. Okay, I'm just introducing the concepts, explaining it, so you can apply it when we go to the test. All right, come back at 10 after 10.
All right.
Okay.